And speaking of power vacuums, Anonymous released a video basically saying that they're going to do all kinds of hacking and damage to Russia and Russia's financial systems and to Putin because of his incursion into Ukraine. And a bunch of people online are cheering it on. It made me think of the insane similarity between vigilantism and cancel culture. The supporters of both presume that they'll always be on the same side as some lawless enforcer or some authority figure. That is an insane assumption that they're always going to agree with you, that your ideas are always going to be the ones they go with. It's not. And this is the flimsiest of alliances because it's one way. They don't know they're in an alliance with you. You're just agreeing with them. But ultimately, you're subjecting yourself to the whims of some outside power. That's insane because they're completely indifferent to your existence and completely unaccountable to you. So you can't support the vigilante option either. Yeah, you might agree with it and say, hey, yeah, Putin deserves it. But eventually it'll come for whatever you support. Careful about the allies you choose. Most of London is holding wealth for oligarchs. You'd go into certain neighborhoods and entire blocks have been purchased up by these guys and no one lives in these apartments. They're just ways of getting money out of Russia because of situations exactly like this. Chinese oligarchs do the same thing and they just buy up entire neighborhoods. So there's these stores that can't stay in business because no one lives in those neighborhoods. To a lesser extent, that's happened in other cities, New York, Sydney. They've tried to cut it down in Australia. But again, it's very hard. These people buy things through brokers or through third parties, and the name on the lease isn't necessarily the person who bought it. So it's much harder to regulate than you think. Can you imagine having the ability to print as much of these magical notes? And when I say print, there's not even printers, it's just numbers on a computer. And then taking out as many loans, from yourself as you want to go buy goods from the rest of the world. It is the ultimate privilege. And it's the only thing keeping this economy together because we're not producing enough to generate real trade. So our trade is financed by debt. Every country wants that type of control. Every country wants to control their currency in exactly that same way. In fact, when a lot of African and South American countries tried to break off from the dollar, they got killed because they didn't have enough leverage. They didn't have enough trade where they could make their currencies viable. So they had to go back and peg their currency to the US dollar. And so they have to acquire dollars before they can buy things like oil. But now you might have to acquire yuan to buy things like Russian oil. Not every attempt to weaken the dollar or to diversify out of the dollar has been unsuccessful. For example, the euro is the most successful diversification out of dollars. Before the euro existed, all of these individual European countries had to trade with the US, and we had unique negotiating relationships and agreements with those countries. We were actually closer together. Now we're negotiating with Europe because they've had that leverage to create their currency, which is also frequently used for oil purchases. Every country wants this power. China wants this power more than anybody because to be free of having to acquire dollars, it's something I wrote about in 2011. This has been an ongoing thing. It's a slow burn, but the world is eventually going to get there. And that's why these insane, stupid ideas like modern monetary theory, I'm not going to get into it here, but people on the far left think the US can print as much money as it wants, take care of all of our problems, healthcare, homelessness, whatever you think the big problems are, climate change, and have no consequences. That is insanity because the world will eventually push back, just like it's pushing back on Putin militarily, it will push back financially. And the pushback is a slow burn in the case of currencies. And that slow burn is slowly moving away from dollars. He uses Russia today very effectively in the US to spread disinformation. I don't know if you've ever seen it. It's pretty popular on YouTube. And he's hired people like Jesse Ventura and a bunch of crypto weirdos. But there's also real news on there and some slightly tilted stories. So taken together, He legitimizes the insane propaganda with what looks like straight news. It really is a brilliant strategy. Now, our media environment has become very fragmented, so it's not as effective as it was when it was super popular, I don't know, 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago. But it's still a brilliant strategy. The good news is I'm 87% sure we can stop Putin by telling him about the damage he's doing to Russia's ESG score, and that we might not have enough diversity, inclusion, and equity consultants to undo it. Everything that was put out there about Trump, a lot of it was false, and now it's come out that it's been falsified. I don't think Trump was the Russian pawn that the people who wrote the fake Russia research to use against him in the election thought he was. And in a way, Putin is the Loki of Europe. Loki is the evil brother of Thor, a fading power prone to mischief. So, Rahm Emanuel famously said, never let a crisis go to waste. Well, already the media is starting in with a bunch of nonsense. CBS News wrote, quote, the U.S. economy has been hit with increased gas prices, inflation, and supply chain issues due to the Ukraine crisis. They figured out that all the stuff that we've been experiencing now for over a year, inflation and supply chain, all this stuff is not due to incompetence or the government printing a bunch of money or companies being greedy. We'll accept that as an answer, or a pure incompetence by the administration and doing nothing about the supply chain. And yet, it was all Ukraine all along. So our experts at Idea Factory, we've narrowed it down to either climate change or white supremacy. I think we're exactly a week away from an article that says, hey, look at what climate change did to Ukraine. It wasn't Putin, it wasn't anything else. Like climate change is really dismantling society. We better do something about climate. Otherwise, more countries will topple over under violent attack. Doesn't Ukraine have any kind of bats or pangolins it could weaponize? A friend of mine wrote me and he was like, they're not going to do anything till after the Olympics. I'm like, well, then extend the Olympics. So make the Olympics an extra 2 years and it'll give us time to negotiate with Russia. Then their roided up athletes aren't going to give up on their medals. And those are just the girls. And when did Kiev, K-I-E-V, that I grew up with and in, become Kyiv, K-Y-I-V? Why? Who put a Y? And net effect is exactly the same. There is zero difference between Kiev and Kyiv. There's not any advantage. What are we doing? Who is on top of this? And then every once in a while, Kiev is trending with the IE. Someone is messing with me. It reminds me of when Gaddafi became Gaddafi with a G, and then every once in a while he'd be Qaddafi with a Q. I'm like, pick one. Now the guy's dead. We can't even ask him. And then I've noticed that Ukraine dropped the. And then I thought about it a little more and I'm like, yeah, it's like getting a verified account for the other guy from Wham. Who's trying to imitate him? I think he could just have a regular account. And Biden's State of the Union should just be, I resign, and here's your new resident, Ro Jogan. I never get to say anything positive about Twitter, but this is really when that platform shines. There is no better place to get instant updates. You see all the videos and the protests and the attacks and the bombings. It's really insanely good. It's what it was meant to do. Unfortunately, most of the time it spends dividing us and destroying things the way Putin destroys things in analog ways. I think they should just shut it down between wars. So Twitter only activates whenever there's a conflict.